Hi, what should we focus on when we're learning a language, and what shouldn't we waste any time on? This is Susan Broder from Speak Languages and Travel the World, here to help you improve your English with minimum effort and maximum benefit. It may seem pretty obvious to you that we should focus our energies when learning a new language on what we need most. But then in reality, when we learn a language, we tend to start from the beginning using old-fashioned books, which go from A and end Z. Now, this is the old-fashioned method and may not actually bring us to where we want to be. So we need to find more modern methods and more focused methods. So in order to learn in a very focused way, we need to first of all be very clear on what we're learning the language for. What are your real needs? Why are you learning the language? Do you need to communicate with colleagues? Are these colleagues foreigners like you, or are they native speakers of English? This makes a big difference, because if they are foreigners, they'll speak with easier terminology and they'll use fewer phrasal verbs. Their language will be more easily comprehensible. Whilst if you're speaking to native speakers, their language will be much more natural, full of idioms and phrasal verbs, and that's where it'll get more difficult to understand them. Do you need to understand speakers at a conference? Do you need to make presentations and speak at a conference? Do you need to understand your colleagues' questions and be able to give them intelligent answers? Do you just need to be able to read the scientific or academic literature? Do you need to speak to and understand the common man on the street? For example, if you're traveling and you ask how to get somewhere, and then they speak really quickly and with lots of idioms and phrasal verbs, obviously that'll be more difficult. Do you need to make phone calls for business or just book a hotel? Where will you be when you're speaking English? Will you mainly be in an English-speaking country such as the UK, the USA, or will you be speaking in a country where English isn't their native language? All these things make a great difference, because depending on who you're surrounded by, it'll give you more or less confidence speaking in English. Depending on who you're surrounded... Oh gosh, it's cold outside. I apologize because it's early in the morning and I just love this green location. But as you can see, it's slightly chilly, and that's why I have a little bit of steam coming out of my mouth when I speak. So what you have to realize is that languages are infinite, and we don't have an infinite time to learn them. So if you're particularly interested in being able to speak in your field for what you're interested in, you have to really start focusing from the beginning. I have an example. I had a medical student who came to me many years ago saying that she didn't really know English. She wanted, though, to be able to read medical texts and research papers as urgently as possible, but she didn't have time to learn English. Well, actually, I was really surprised at how well we managed to get her to understand texts within a couple of weeks. Because we realized that medical texts and scientific texts are all written in the passive tense generally. Then there are always more or less the same set of verbs being used. So once we had pinpointed the series of verbs, which were really not more than maybe 20, and the grammatical structure, which was mainly passive because tests have been carried out, or the drug was tested on a series of patients, the results were evaluated, the outcomes were compared. These are all passive constructions. So as you can see, we managed to pinpoint the verbs, we managed to pinpoint the grammatical structure. Of course, we needed to refine the vocabulary that was most important for her. And of course, she didn't understand every word, but she understood the concepts with the minimum vocabulary, the minimum number of verbs, and the grammatical structure. Within, I'd say, less than a month, she was able to understand the gist of these medical research papers. and it was very, very rewarding for me as a teacher and for her to be able to immediately get into the subject, forgetting all the rest of the language. It wasn't interesting for her to be able to order a beer at the pub. She needed to do that, and we focused on that, and the results were amazing. So focusing on your needs is absolutely mandatory if you want to make progress pretty quickly. Another problem that has often been addressed occurred to me very recently. So I hadn't been to the UK for many, many years, and as a teacher of English, I started listening very closely to the language and realized that it's really not easy to teach English to someone who has to understand English on the street, because English on the street now is so different from what it used to be. 40 years ago in the UK, the population was prevalently British. Of course, there were many people who had come in, but I would definitely say it was 50-50. Now, in the big cities in particular, I was amazed at how many people are permanently living there, have set up their own businesses, so they are an integral part of the country, but they are not native speakers. You can hear it very well. So if I'm teaching a person to understand English, when they actually go to the UK, they'll hear so many different accents, which are not only native accents from all the different regions of the UK, which is already very, very difficult, because as in many countries, it varies from north to south, from east to west. So that's already a difficulty. But on top of that, you'll have all the foreign accents. And all these different accents make understanding English really, really difficult. Therefore, nowadays, you have to be less focused on trying to speak English like a native speaker with a very British accent or an American accent or a Canadian accent. It's more important to be able to communicate at all in the English language. That's the most important thing. If you can then refine your language and communicate very well, that's better in the sense of using phrasal verbs and idioms and so on. But that's not the fundamental thing. The fundamental thing is to be able to communicate your ideas to other people. And the other fundamental thing is to be able to understand English broadly, spoken by a variety of accents, and therefore one of the best ways to do that is to be exposed to multiple accents. And nowadays, watching programs on video, on TV, on Netflix is the best way to get exposed to all these multiple accents. And when you're exposed to these multiple accents, you'll be able to learn the language, to understand the language in the best way. So now we know what to focus on. What shouldn't we focus on? What shouldn't we waste our time on? What shouldn't we waste our time on? Well, many students decide that they want to learn lists of phrasal verbs, books full of idioms, and they're of course they're very important, but they're not important enough to waste time on. As I said, first you have to focus on your specific needs. Once you've focused on those, it's important to learn the phrasal verbs and the idioms which are pertinent again to your needs. Therefore, you should try and find the ones which are easiest for you to remember, the ones that you hear most, films, these programs, and not just learn a whole list. It's impossible, and it really makes no sense. Also because, as I said, many people are not native speakers, they won't even be using them. So I would definitely say, for example, if you're a doctor, go and learn the phrasal verbs pertinent to your field. If you're interested in sport, find the phrasal verbs that are pertinent to sports, and so on. Look for the language which you'll be using the most, and then learn the phrases in context. Don't just learn lists of phrases, don't learn lists of phrasal verbs, but try and put them into context and make meaningful sentences for you that will help you remember them and will make you use them spontaneously. I often say one of the best ways to do that, to be sure that you're actually using the language correctly, is to take the phrasal verb that you'd like to learn, put it into youglish.com, for example, and see what film clips come out with those expressions, and then write them down and try and learn those. Write maybe 3, 4, 5 down, and so if you repeat those and then similar sentences pertinent to your own real life, that way they'll become quite natural to you. Another thing you should absolutely not waste your time on is grammar, in the sense that grammar is important, but it's not so important that grammar has to be above your capability to express yourself correctly. If you focus too much on grammar, you're going to be very worried about making mistakes, and then you won't communicate. Something that's very important for us to realize is that language evolves. And schools abroad tend to focus very much on grammar, but grammar is also evolving. And so schools will create tests for students where they absolutely have to distinguish between going to as a future form or the present continuous plus future form. And both of these have to be distinguished very strictly. So going to as an intention, whilst for example, I'm going to play tennis tomorrow as an intention, whilst I'm playing tennis tomorrow as a fixed organized event. And students, if they make a mistake, will be penalized. But nowadays, they're quite interchangeable. And this is one of the reasons why one shouldn't focus too much on the grammar, because it's just not that important. Now, native speakers are not so strict about it, and it's the speaker himself who knows whether it was an intention or whether it was already programmed. And so it's very difficult to test something like that, and it's really not that important. The same goes for must and have to. These schools abroad focus very much on the difference of when you should say must and when you should say have to. But nowadays we're often using them interchangeably. Not 100%, but we can use them interchangeably. Therefore, we don't need to mark students' work right or wrong when it's a situation where it could have been used interchangeably. Therefore, it's really not so important to focus on the grammar. You shouldn't waste time focusing on the grammar to the point that you won't then communicate. Is it really important whether you have to or must? We understand that it's a kind of obligation, and that's it. That's the concept that you're trying to communicate. So don't waste time on lists of vocabulary, verbs, etc. Just learn chunks of language that are useful and meaningful to you, and don't waste time on unnecessary grammatical differences. A lot of the grammar is important, but it doesn't have to get in the way of you communicating. So to summarize, what should you focus on when you're learning a language? Eliminate anything that is not pertinent to your needs. First of all, concentrate on your specific needs and eliminate everything else. That is something that you can delve into over time once you've satisfied your communication needs for your job or for your pleasure. And the other thing is not to waste time on unnecessary grammar and lists of phrasal verbs and idioms. Just again, pick and choose what you need and forget the rest. Learn the language in chunks, just like children would, and use those chunks spontaneously, and your language will improve automatically. There's time to delve into the details subsequently once you're satisfying your primary needs of communication in your job or for your pleasure. I think this is very, very important for your personal growth and also for your motivation and satisfaction in learning a language. Once you see that you're managing to communicate and that you're going to progress, once you found the motivation and you'll see your progress, you'll be able to find the energy to continue studying the language in more depth. So make sure you implement these strategies, and if you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe. hit the notification bell so you can be notified the next time I upload a video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye. Depending on who you're oh gosh, it's cold outside. Oh my gosh. That is no good. Depending on who you're oh my gosh.